The night was cold, but her skin burned. She never wanted this. She never imagined that the price she paid would be far greater than money. She only wanted an education. She only wanted to survive. But one decision changed her life forever. When she learned the truth, it was already too late. Ada was just like any other girl, full of dreams, but life was cruel to her. From the moment the sun rose, she was on her feet, weaving through the crowded streets with a tray of groundnuts balanced on her hands. She called out to strangers, her voice strained, her lips dry from the dust that clung to the air. Some bought, most ignored. But she kept going, because she had no choice. She walked home alone, past houses filled with laughter she could never share. Her dress, once bright, was now dull, worn thin at the elbows. Her slippers scraped against the ground, the soles barely holding together. At night, she sat in the corner of a small rented room, hugging her knees to her chest, listening to the voices of the world beyond her door. The world that moved forward without her. Her parents were gone. The school had shut its gates to her. And with every passing day, the walls of her future closed in tighter, until there was barely space left to breathe. She had tried everything. Begged the school principal for more time. Searched for work that would pay enough. Prayed to a sky that no longer answered. But hunger does not wait, and neither do debts. It was in this desperation that she met him. A man whose hands carried wealth, whose words dripped with promises. He spoke of opportunity, of a life beyond the struggle. He looked at her the way no one had before, not with pity, but with certainty. Like she was something valuable. And in that moment, Ada believed him. But what she did not know was that some promises are made with tongues dipped in poison. The walls of Ada's world continued to shrink, pressing in from all sides. Each morning, she walked to school with hope stitched into the fold of her dress, but hope alone could not pay school fees. She stood outside the classroom, her books clutched to her chest, her heart pounding. She avoided the principal's eyes, but it did not matter. His voice came like a blade, sharp and final. Her name was called, and her feet felt heavy as she walked to the front of the class. The whispers from her classmates crawled along her skin. The shame burned deep, but shame could not change what was written in the school's records: fees unpaid. Desks and chairs belonged only to those who could afford them. She stepped out of the schoolyard, her uniform now a mark of exile. The sun above was bright, but her world had dimmed. The gates closed behind her, and with them, another piece of her future slipped away. The streets had no mercy. The market was alive with shouts and movement, but to Ada, it felt hollow. She gripped the tray of groundnuts tighter, willing her hands not to tremble. She weaved between the stalls, calling out for buyers, but hunger made her voice weak. Coins were tossed her way, but they were never enough. Then came the landlord. A knock on the door, firm and unyielding. She had already prepared her words, pleas, promises, but his face was torn. "One more week," she whispered. "But stone does not bend." "2 days," he replied, his voice leaving no room for hope. The door shut behind him, and Ada sank to the floor, the weight of her life pressing down harder than ever before. That night, the shadows stretched longer, the silence in her room heavier. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she ignored it, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold her world together. But then came a knock, not from the landlord this time, but from someone who claimed to know a way out. Temi, a friend whose smiles were lined with secrets. Her words were honey and venom mixed together. She spoke of men who did not ask questions, only handed out money. She spoke of choices, but Ada could not see any. "Just one time," Temi said. Enough to change everything. The air in the room grew thick, her mind tangled in a battle with itself. She stared at the cracked ceiling, the walls that had never belonged to her, the empty space where food should have been. And then, she looked down at herself. At what she had left. Her fingers trembled as she traced the hem of her dress. It was not innocence she held, it was survival. And survival did not wait for dignity. As the night deepened, she paced back and forth, the rhythm of her footsteps a heartbeat of uncertainty. Her mind whispered warnings, but the world outside whispered something else: "What choice do you have?" The moon watched as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring into nothingness. The answer was not spoken, but it settled over her like a heavy cloth. Tomorrow, she would meet him. The night held its breath as Ada stepped out of the taxi, her hands tightening around the folds of her dress. The building before her rose high into the sky, its glass windows reflecting the city lights like 1,000 watching eyes. This was a place she had never entered before, a place where men counted wealth not in naira, but in power. She walked through the grand doors, her footsteps swallowed by thick carpets, her presence barely acknowledged by those who belonged here. The air smelled of money, of cigars, of expensive cologne and quiet sins. Chief Okafor sat in a corner of the lobby, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of his chair. He was a man whose wealth needed no introduction. His clothes were tailored to perfection, his shoes untouched by dust. His eyes, deep and unreadable, settled on Ada, measuring her the way a merchant examines his wares. He spoke, his voice smooth, each word laced with something that was neither warmth nor kindness, but something more dangerous, certainty. She had heard about men like him. Men who built their lives on the desperation of others. Men who took, but never gave. Yet, she listened. Because hunger listens. Because fear obeys. Because dreams do not come free. He placed an envelope on the table. The weight of it was undeniable. It held more than she had ever touched, more than she had ever imagined. More than her school fees, more than the cost of a home, more than all the nights she had spent crying into a pillow that could not comfort her. The paper felt smooth beneath her fingertips. A life paid for in advance. A contract with no ink, only silence. She took a deep breath. She nodded. The room that night was quiet, the walls thick enough to trap every sound. Time moved slowly, then all at once. And when the night finally surrendered to morning, Ada opened her eyes to a world that was no longer the same. The air felt different. Heavy, yet empty. The bed beside her was cold, Chief Okafor was gone. Only the envelope remained, as if to remind her that what had been taken could never be returned. She sat up, pressing a hand to her stomach. A dull ache paused beneath her skin. Her fingers grazed something strange, a mark, faint but present, like a brand pressed into her flesh. Her breath caught in her throat. It was nothing, she told herself. Just a trick of the mind. A shadow that would fade. She gathered her things, willed herself to forget. She walked out of the hotel, the money clutched tight in her hands. But with every step, something followed her, something unseen yet lingering, calling around her like smoke. She thought she had escaped poverty. She didn't know she had just sold something far more precious than money. Far from the city lights, beyond the paved roads and the reach of law, there stood a house unlike any other. It was not a home. It was a place of secrets, a place where the spirits of the old world still answered when called. A place where men came to trade things that could not be bought in markets. Chief Okafor entered without hesitation, his footsteps silent against the earth. The air inside was thick, thicker than the night, heavier than breath. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, their meanings known only to those who spoke the tongue of the unseen. Smoke curled from the corners, shifting and whispering, as if the walls themselves were alive. At the center of the room, the native doctor waited. His face was hidden behind red and white markings, his robe worn thin by time. Before him, a wooden bowl sat upon the ground, its surface dark and still. But the silence did not last. The native doctor raised his hands, his voice rising in a chant older than memory. The bowl trembled. The liquid inside, thick and red, began to glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. Chief Okafor did not flinch. He had seen this before. He had done this before. The native doctor's voice grew louder, the words rolling like thunder. The flames in the room flickered, bending as if answering an unseen presence. Then, with a voice that was no longer his own, the native doctor spoke. Her blood is now tied to your wealth, but she must suffer for it. The bowl shuddered. A ripple spread across the surface, and with it, something unseen was unleashed. Far away, in a small rented room, Ada woke with a gasp. Her breath was shallow, her skin damp with sweat. Her body felt wrong, as though something had been taken from her in the night. She tried to move, but a weight pressed down on her chest. The air around her was thick, unmoving. The darkness of the room stretched further than it should have. The shadows on the walls were no longer still. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. A coldness spread through her veins, deeper than fear, deeper than anything she had ever known. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The world outside continued as it always had, but Ada did not. Her steps grew slower, her body weaker. The money in her hands felt heavier now, though she could not explain why. Hunger no longer gnawed at her stomach, yet she felt hollow, as if something within her had been emptied. Days passed, but Ada did not heal. At night, the walls whispered, voices too faint to be heard, too loud to be ignored. The mark on her stomach darkened, twisting like ink in water. And the shadows, those shadows that once obeyed the light, began to move on their own. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. That she was imagining things. That it would pass. But the body does not lie. The spirit does not forget. One night, as the silence deepened and the darkness thickened, Ada felt it again. The weight. The breath of something unseen against her skin. Her body convulsed, pain ripping through her chest. Her fingers clawed at the sheets, her throat raw from a scream that never fully left her lips. She gasped for air. Her vision blurred. And in that moment, she understood. Something inside her was changing. And it wasn't normal. The night no longer belonged to Ada. It watched her. Followed her. Stretched its fingers into the corners of her room and waited. Her body, once full of strength, had become a shell. The air around her grew colder each night, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. Her lips darkened, her eyes dulled, and when she looked into the mirror, something else looked back. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief, unsteady reflection that did not move as she did. But soon, the flicker became a face. A face she knew. A face she could never forget. Chief Okafor stared at her from within the glass, his expression unchanging, his eyes empty. No matter how many times she turned away, he was always there. Watching. Then came the voices. They whispered her name in the darkness, curling through the silence like fingers reaching for her throat. They spoke in tones neither harsh nor kind, but in a way that made her skin crawl. Made her heart pound. Made the walls of her room feel smaller and smaller. Sleep became a distant memory. When she closed her eyes, she saw things that should not be seen, places she had never been, shadows that moved without form. When she opened them, the room was no longer safe. The walls breathed. The ceiling shifted. And always, the whispers. Her friend Temi saw the change before Ada could speak of it. Her skin had lost its warmth, her voice its steadiness. She no longer flinched at the cold because she was the cold. She no longer shivered because her body had forgotten how. Temi took her to a doctor, thinking there must be a cure. That sickness, once named, could be undone. But the doctor only looked at Ada for a long time, his brows furrowed, his fingers pressing against the post that barely throbbed in her wrist. He asked questions, but Ada had no answers that fit within the world of the living. And then, the doctor leaned in, his voice low, careful. "This is not a sickness of the body," he said, "but of the spirit." Temi's breath caught in her throat. Ada's fingers tightened in her lap. The words lingered between them, heavy and unmoving. There was no cure to be found here. No medicine, no remedy, no path forward that did not lead back into the shadows that had claimed her. There was only one place left. A place she had not seen in years. A place where the old ways still held power, where the spirits of the land still whispered their secrets to those who knew how to listen. She had only one surviving family. And though time had passed, and distance had grown, Ada knew there was no other choice. She packed what little she had. Wrapped herself in the clothes of a girl who had once been whole. And as the first rays of morning light bled into the sky, she turned away from the city that had swallowed her and set her path toward the village that had once been home. Where her grandmother waited. The road to the village was long, winding through fields of silent trees and rivers that carried whispers from the past. The air was different here, thicker, richer, as if it held the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. Ada stepped into the land of her ancestors, but the land did not welcome her. Not yet. Her grandmother's house stood where it always had, nestled beneath the arms of an ancient baobab tree. The walls, made of red clay, bore the marks of time, but they stood firm, unmoved by the years. The air smelled of crushed herbs, of wood smoke, of prayers murmured into the wind. Before Ada could speak, her grandmother stepped forward, her gaze sharp, piercing through the veil of sickness that clung to her granddaughter. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. "They have taken something from you," she said, her voice steady as the earth beneath their feet. "But they will regret it." She took Ada's hands, tracing the coldness that had seeped into her veins. Her fingers, lined with age, trembled, not with weakness, but with knowledge. She had seen this before. She knew the cost of stolen blood. That night, the old woman prepared. She crushed roots between stone, whispered incantations into bowls of dark water. She placed a wooden staff by the door, the carvings deep, old, filled with stories of battles fought beyond the word of men. The spirits had been called. Now, they would answer. Ada lay upon a woven mat, her breath shallow, her body a vessel for something that did not belong. Her grandmother sat beside her, a bundle of burning leaves in her hands. She waved the smoke over Ada's body, chanting words that cracked through the silence like thunder. The fire in the clay pot flared high, twisting unnaturally, reaching for the sky as if trying to escape what was coming. Then Ada convulsed. Her body arched, her hands clawing at the air. Shadows burst from her skin, writhing, twisting, fighting to hold on. Her voice shattered the night, a cry not entirely her own. The spirits inside her did not want to leave. They had been fed, tied to her blood, bound by a ritual older than she could comprehend. But her grandmother was older still. She struck the staff against the ground, and the earth trembled. The air grew thick with power, with forces unseen but felt. The spirits of the ancestors stirred, awakened by the disturbance, and they did not come with kindness. They came with judgment. A gust of wind howled through the room, though the night was still outside. The flames pulsed, and then, a sound, a force, a power beyond the reach of human hands. Miles away, in the depths of his shrine, Chief Okafor staggered. His chest tightened, his breath caught. The symbols carved into the wooden walls of his ritual room glowed with an eerie light, their power reversing, turning against him. The bow that had once held Ada's blood cracked, a deep splinter spreading across its surface like a wound. He gasped, clutching his heart. The spirits that had once obeyed him now turned their gaze upon him. And their judgment was swift. Back in the village, Ada screamed one last time, and then, silence. The shadows that had clung to her body dissolved, vanishing into the air like mist beneath the rising sun. The mark on her stomach faded, its presence wiped away as if it had never been. Her body stilled. Her breath returned. Her grandmother watched, unmoving, waiting for what would come next. And then, slowly, Ada's eyes fluttered open. The dullness was gone. The cold had lifted. She was whole again. Her soul was returned, but the battle was not over. The morning after Ada's soul was restored, the air felt different. Lighter. The whispers had faded, the shadows no longer clung to her skin. But the weight of what had been done remained. And Ada knew that this was not the end. The spirits had reclaimed what was stolen, but justice still belonged to the world of the living. Chief Okafor's debt had not yet been paid in full. Ada and her grandmother journeyed back to the city, carrying with them more than just a story. They carried truth, sharp as a blade, undeniable as the rising sun. They carried names, places, the echoes of others who had been lost to the same hunger, the same greed. The police listened. Not because they believed in spirits, not because they feared curses, but because wealth leaves behind trails, and power built on blood is never truly hidden. The raid came before the dawn. They moved through the grand gates, past the marble floors, the towering walls built to keep out consequences. The mansion that had once stood untouchable was torn open, its secrets laid bare beneath the flashing lights of justice. And there, hidden behind doors meant to stay locked forever, they found what could not be denied. A shrine of wealth and wickedness. Symbols carved into wood, still pulsing with the remnants of stolen power. Ritual bowls cracked and dry, holding nothing but the memory of those who had suffered. Papers, names, proof of lives, traded for fortunes. A temple built on deception, now crumbling beneath the weight of truth. Chief Okafor did not speak when they took him. His mouth opened, but no words came. Perhaps the spirits had stolen his voice, the same way he had stolen so much from others. Or perhaps, for the first time in his life, there was nothing left to say. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Faces filled the gallery, mothers who had lost daughters, fathers who had searched in vain, girls who had once been innocent but had walked away with empty souls. Eyes filled with grief, with rage, with quiet, unshaken resolve. The judge spoke, his voice ringing through the hall, final and absolute. Life in prison. No wealth to shield him, no power to unmake the truth. The same hands that once counted money now were the weight of iron. The same feet that walked upon gold now dragged across the cold, grey floors of a cell meant for men who could not be forgiven. And so, the world moved forward. The city forgot him. His name, once spoken with fear, faded into silence. But the spirits did not forget. The ancestors did not forgive. And the wealth he had traded for blood slipped through his fingers like dust. He took advantage of young girls, but in the end, the spirits took everything from him. The wind does not forget the path it has traveled. The river does not erase the stones that once shaped its course. And the choices we make, no matter how desperate, leave footprints that cannot be washed away. Ada sought a future, a chance to escape the hunger that had become her shadow. But in the hands of a man who traded in the misfortune of others, her innocence became currency. Her blood became wealth. And in the moment she thought she had freed herself, she was bound in chains she could not see. But fate is a path with many turns. And for those who walk with clean hands, the ancestors watch. They guide, they warn, they restore. What was taken was returned. What was broken was mended. But the scars remained, not as a wound, but as a lesson. Money can never replace dignity. Quick riches always come with a price. And those who feast on the suffering of others will one day choke on their own greed. To those who stand where Ada once stood, feeling trapped between survival and sacrifice, know this, there's always another way. The night may be long, but the sun will rise. The road may be difficult, but it is never truly closed. And when the world offers you gold that glows too brightly, remember, some shine only to blind. What would you do in Ada's situation? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Like and subscribe for more African folktales, where the past speaks, the present listens, and the future learns. For the spirits do not sleep, and the lessons of old still whisper in the wind.